Here's what this makes me want to do. After hearing Jereme, you talk about, culture's a 10 on a 1 to 10 scale and everything that you're saying here, I'm like, I got to have a chief culture officer now. I got to have a chief change officer. Like, I got to elevate this to a C-suite level because it has such a profound impact on my business. Typically, HR has kind of been the department that is, I wouldn't say in charge of culture, right? But they're the ones that are thinking about it the most and who we usually turn to and rely on. But most HR leaders, and I've talked to a ton, I run an entire podcast just for HR professionals. They have imposter syndrome. They have a terrible time struggling to get a seat at the table. They are looked upon as a support department. They are not what we just described here in terms of the agents that are going to help us make these changes internally. So, Jereme, I'd love to just know your perspective on the importance of the HR function and should they have a seat at the table?
No, I think it's certainly critically important, right? Because as you mentioned, they're typically the ones in a typical organization that are looked to, as you mentioned, to kind of have a pulse on the people, right? Whether that's fair or not, or if that's always the case, but that's the kind of perception of that. And I think just one of the things we have to keep in perspective is the growing business. And again, I can kind of talk back to my experience, right? Again, once upon a time, doesn't seem that long ago, I was the HR, I was the CEO, the COO, right? The attorney, all of those things. And so we have to also keep in mind these companies that are going through that growth from, you know, we don't have an HR department, right? We don't have a COO even, right? You're kind of trying to prioritize those things, right? As you grow, like, okay, do we need an HR person? Is this the time? Is it in our budget, right? Can we afford that? We made that change last year, right? We were able to say, hey, we know we need it, but we're finally at a place that we can invest in it, right? Because it is an investment in the company and your people. And that, we have a meeting every week, right, with our HR person, and we go over kind of the pulse of things, right? Again, it allows me to maybe it's critically important in my mind too, right? The culture. But I can delegate some of those duties now, and we can make it better, right? Because quite frankly, you can only do so much, right? Kind of what we're talking about a little bit here too. But now we have an HR department. We have someone who's really investing more time into that. And so it's been a big benefit to us. They absolutely should have a seat at the table because, again, it's critical to retaining, getting the best out of your employees, right? Getting the best version of themselves, having a pulse on that, right? Because that's a difficult thing. Not everybody's running up to me telling me about what challenges and issues they're having. In fact, I'm often the last person that they want to talk to about those things. So it's really important that communication is happening and there's a space for them to do that. But then that information is getting to the rest of the C-suite, right? The rest of management. So we understand, okay, these are some of the challenges that we're facing and how do we improve? How do we make, the situation better, whether it's our culture or just helping that person. So that communication, having that seat at the table, I think a big part of that is just simply the communication that happens when they are at the table, getting that information, and then we can look to make and continue to make improvements. If they're not at the table, you're missing a big piece there.
I know that, Mo, part of what you're going to say is that leadership themselves has a huge role in all of this, right? But what's your point of view on HR and needing to have them have a seat at the table and why?
Yeah, I think, and I would say all of this is an and. I don't think it's an either or, right? When you were talking about we need a chief people officer, an HR officer, and you need particularly your frontline managers and every individual contributor, because culture is how actually things get done. And that's through the people. But there has to be somebody that is strategically thinking about people having the capacity to do that. I think most HR folks don't have a seat at the table because they're compliance based. They came up through how are we keeping, what are our payroll policies? Are we making sure we're onboarding, offboarding? Because that takes a lot of work, right? To stay on the right side of the law. The great news right now, I would say one of the positives from AI disruption is a lot of that kind of rote, mundane policy that can be done with AI now. And if you want somebody to have the seat at the table, make sure that that person really understands that they are profit and loss driven. They know the numbers, they understand the strategy, and they're looking and saying, do we have the human capacity today to deliver on this strategy? And what do I need to be thinking about? What do we need to be thinking about 5 years from now? But actually, 5 is a little long, maybe 3 years from now. What capacity, what skills, the human talent that we have, what do we need to be doing to be ready for what we have in our strategy versus compliance?